The light calls the drowned. The storm made a bruise of the sky. John saw it first, an ugly stain swelling over the Atlantic low, and mean as if the ocean itself had pressed its forehead against the horizon and decided to push. Patrick swore they could outrun it in the skiff. Simon, quiet and watchful, only checked the knots and the oarlocks, then looked once more toward the black tooth of rock where the abandoned lighthouse rose. A ribcage of iron, a skull of fractured glass, a place the chart still named, but only to warn. The first warning came as a long, low moan from the water, not wind, but something older, a cathedral organ singing one note from the seabed. John gripped the thwart until his knuckles shone. Far off, the surf began to hammer the shoals, each blow a heavy thunder that shook the skiff's thin boards. "You two want to sleep in that?" Patrick asked, chin jerking at the lighthouse. He tried to laugh, but it snagged in his throat. The place looked diseased. The lantern room was a shattered eye crusted with salt. The catwalk was bent and rusting, and the keeper's house huddled beside the tower with its windows boarded, as if it were ashamed of its own view. "We don't get a vote," Simon said. His voice always sounded like a simple fact. He dug his oar deep, and the skiff nosed for the cove, where a collapsed dock made a crude sickle in the dark. When the squall finally hit the wind, it arrived like a sheet of rain, hissing at that silver wood. John flinched and laughed at himself. He'd sailed enough nor'easters to know the ritual, a little gallows humor, a lot of quiet labor, and the feeling never spoken that the ocean didn't know you existed until the moment it wanted you. The three men hauled the skiff above the tide line and stumbled up a path of shattered shells. The wind slapped their faces with wet weed. The lighthouse door was chained but loose. The wood had swelled and split around the hasp. Patrick levered it with a length of driftwood, and the chain gave like an old spine. The door coughed as it opened a hoarse bark of swollen hinges that echoed up the tower like a dog inside a well. They stepped into a throat of stone. Stairs spiraled upward, slick with brine. The smell inside was antique lamp oil, mouse droppings, mold, and something faintly sweet like old flowers crushed in salt. John touched the wall and felt it trembling with the weather. A lighthouse speaks a grammar of necessity. Even abandoned it once ordered dry clothes, a small fire food you can eat in the dark. They found a corner in the keeper's house where the roof still held, and a coal stove squatted rusted but usable. Simon took charge of the simple mercies. Patrick checked the cupboards, came up with a dusty tin of tea and a coil of abandoned rope. John, who had once believed he was done with all this. The damp, the rust, the feeling of living inside a bell, poked among the keeper's relics, a journal furred with mildew, a cracked barometer, a brass speaking tube that ran up toward the lantern room like a fossil artery. Somewhere above, a pane of glass clattered in its frame, tapping like a loose tooth. They drank thin tea and warmed their hands over the stove. Only then did they speak the rumor they all knew. "They say the light never went out," Patrick said. "It went out," John said too quickly. A storm took the keeper and his assistant, reefed the whole of the catwalk, smashed the lens. Simon stirred the tea with a rusty spoon. Then why do fishermen keep reporting a beam from the rocks? John didn't answer. He listened to the wind pry at a boarded window, making a slow, astonished whistle in the cracks. Patrick unshouldered his pack. He was the youngest, all quick jokes and careful haircuts, the kind of sailor who kept a tin of pomade even when there wasn't fresh water to drink. He pulled out a bottle, held it up. "St. Patrick's courage," he said, and grinned. Simon's mouth said no. Patrick's grin sagged back into the bottle. John shrugged. He had no sermon left in him. He remembered another lighthouse long ago, and a woman on the rocks waving her shawl like a flag, and the way grief makes you think you can outshout water. The first night noises came as they banked the stove low, a faint tapping that traveled the pipes, and then a slow scrape along the corridor like a boot sole grinding damp grit. Rats, Patrick said. Big as lobsters up here. Simon shook his head once. Listen. Under the wind and the skitter of rain was something rhythmic, hollow and precise, the strike of a ship's bell. 1, 2, 3. The counting strokes that once marked fog and distance. Could be a buoy, John said, but he knew these shoals. No buoy could live in this throat of water. Not anymore. They made a plan without calling it that. They would stay through the storm. Come morning, if the skiff still had a belly and the sea did not chew it, they would run south for the river mouth and daylight. John took first watch. He climbed the spiral lantern in his fist. The steps leaned inward like a rib cage trying to protect its last good organ. The tower breathed. He felt it exhaling a tired, wet sigh with each gust that shoved at stones. His lantern made saints of the salt streaks, every drip wore a halo. In the lantern room, the glass was mostly gone, but the iron frame still hooked the air. The great lens had shattered long ago, cataracts of glass lying like ice around the room's throat. John set the lantern on the old pedestal where the lamp once lived. Below the ocean was only motion, a continent of black muscle gnashing its teeth at the rocks. He tried not to think about how many men it had eaten. He tried not to think about the keeper's last walk across the catwalk, the way a gust can be a hand. On the pedestal beside his lantern lay something he had not seen. At first, a shard of the old Fresnel lens knees of prismed glass, with one edge polished by wind and salt. He picked it up. The thing magnified his lantern into a small sun and threw off a rainbow so clean it made his eyes ache. From below, the brass speaking tube thumped once metal against metal, a hollow sound like a knuckle rapping the lid of a coffin. John went very still. Then came a voice, thin as breath dragged through reed's light. The way. He told himself it was a trick of pipe and weather. He told himself Simon was testing the tube, or Patrick was drunk enough to play a joke. But the words had an accent he couldn't place a century-old salt on the tongue. Who's there? He asked the open mouth of the tube. The answer came not as words, but as a chorus of distant shouts, the rise and fall cadence of men on a line, heaving together, time to a sea that crushed and released, crushed and released. John felt it in the soles of his feet. He saw it then just for a heartbeat, the smear of pallid faces in the water below, turned upward like lilies under ice. He took the shard of lens and set it so his lantern's flame burned through it. The pedestal threw the light outward in a clumsy fan. Not a true beam, the heart of the lighthouse had been gutted, but enough to carve a ragged swath across the breakers. The tower answered with a new noise, a deep-bellied hum, as if iron remembered its original vow and tried to sing it again. By the time he clattered back down the stairs, each step speaking a different complaint, a choked squeak here, a dull thump there. Patrick and Simon were awake. Patrick had the bottle in his hand and fury in his face. You don't light that thing, he said. I didn't, John said. Not properly. Just a shard. Simon took the shard and turned it so the lantern flared. He didn't like what it did to the room. The flare made every shadow hiss, the stove pop like knuckles cracking its roof. They asked, John said. Who, Patrick demanded. John told them about the voice and the shouts. He didn't say what he'd seen in the water. Simon looked at the ceiling as if there were anything to see there but sores of black mold. Men die in storms, Simon said. They talk. That doesn't oblige us. Outside, a wave detonated against the rock with a beam so enormous it shook flecks of plaster from the ceiling and made the old barometer clatter against the wall. They took turns trying to sleep. John lay on his side and watched the stove's mouth. Somewhere between one breath and the next, he heard footsteps above them, not along the spiral stair, but across the catwalk that had been missing for 20 years. Boot heels on the iron tap, 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 and then a long scrape like a heavy door dragged through stone. He rose. Simon was already up, eyes open, listening. Patrick mumbled and rolled over, a bottle tumbling from his fingers. They didn't speak. The footsteps crossed overhead again, faster now. And then came the unmistakable whir and click of a mechanism that hadn't existed here since the night the keeper vanished, and the old clockwork winding itself, chain, whispering gears, biting into their own teeth with a stubborn little chatter. Impossible, John whispered. Simon shook his head once, not in denial, but as a man accepting the number tattooed on his wrist. We shouldn't have lit anything, he said. The speaking tube breathed a wet inhale and then coughed out a series of tones, two short, one long, the fog signal pattern for a wreck on the starboard side. John's blood turned to glass. What do they want? Patrick asked, voice small. To be seen, John said, or to make us see. The storm had pressed the world to the thickness of a coin. By dawn, the coin would flip. Men called it weather. Priests called it providence. On certain coasts, old women called it the tax the living pay to the drowned. John climbed the stairs again with Simon at his back. Patrick followed because he was the kind of man who couldn't stand to be left alone in a haunted place. The lantern room had become an open mouth, chewing rain. The shard of lens on the pedestal gave back their light with an eager glitter. Don't, Simon said, but John had already placed the lantern. He turned the shard until the beam, such as it was, cut a path across the water like a blade, gouging flesh. He swept it slow. From below, a cry rose, wordless, raw, the kind of sound a man makes when the wave that keeps him alive becomes the wave that takes him. John flinched and nearly dropped the lens. Then another cry closer, breaking into a cough that sounded thick with salt. Patrick crossed himself without irony. We're not priests. We can't shrive the sea. Maybe not, John said, and he thought of the keeper's last ledger entries, which he had skimmed earlier, notations of oil and wick entries that had turned into prayers near the end. But a light is a promise, or a summons, Simon said. They kept the makeshift beam moving. All through the night, the tower filled with a weave of noises, the rain ceaseless round the stove pulse, the slow clack of gears that should not have been the far bell's counting distance, and under it all, the long breath of the ocean. In and out, like a god asleep and dreaming bad dreams. When the gray of morning finally seeped through the broken glass, the storm had not broken so much as settled into a siege. The sea was a field of tents, each wave a pitched canvas, shuddering on its pole. John's eyes ached. Patrick's hands shook. Simon looked older by 10 years. 2 more hours, Simon said. If it lets us, we go. Something knocked at the base of the tower, then 3 hollow blows spaced upwards. Boom, 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 followed by the groan of wood dragged over the rock. I looked at him. John went first. Simon gathered the rope. Patrick, who loved stories about the sea but did not like meeting them, cursed softly and followed. The door stood open to a rain that fell straight and heavy, the kind that fattens puddles into little oceans. In the cove, the skiff had not only survived, it had acquired company. A long black spar had wedged itself against the rocks. A tangle of netting and rope trailed from it, and caught in that net as if delivered with purpose, lay a canvas-wrapped shape the size of a man. Patrick spat into the rain. Absolutely not. John was already moving. The promise of a light and the promise a light extracts were old debts in him. Simon tied a line around John's waist and paid it out slowly as John climbed down the wet rocks. The ocean made its eating sounds all around him. Gulp, suck, slap, as if tasting him in advance. He reached the spar and touched the canvas. It was stiff with salt and heavy with water. He pulled. The shape rolled toward him like a seal. "Help me," he called. And this time, it was a living voice, scared and practical. Simon came down boots, finding old holdfasts. Patrick stayed above, watching the line coil around his wrist like a warning. They hauled the bundle up into the lee of the tower and cut it open with a bait knife. Inside was not a body, but a coat, a great coat of thick wool seaman's, make black and old. In its pockets, a brass key. A tiny glass vial stoppered with wax, filled with something that caught the light in trembling scales. A lead tag stamped with a Lighthouse emblem that matched the ironwork upstairs. Patrick laughed, but it was a weak sound that tried to be brave and failed. "Treasure tools," Simon said. John turned the key in his hands. The teeth were chewed by salt. He knew with the knowledge of muscle that the key would fit something upstairs. Behind them, from the open door, the speaking tube let out a single clear chime, as delicate as a spoon struck against crystal, and then whispered almost conversationally, "Keeper." They carried the coat inside. The vial rattled against the key like a tiny heartbeat in John's pocket. Above the lighthouse gave forth a faint ticking, not a ghost's sound, but an instrument, like a watch restarted after years of silence. 2 hours, Simon repeated, but his eyes were on the stairs. The lighthouse had given them a coat and a key. The ocean had delivered the package like a butcher's boy. It was a beginning or the continuation of a story that had begun long before they were born. John thought of oaths men take and break. He thought of how certain places don't forgive. He looked up the spiral and felt for the first time that the tower was not merely above him, but around him, inside his breath, inside his bones, like a bell waiting for a clapper. He closed his hand on the key. Very softly, almost tenderly, the wind found a crack in the boarded window and made a flute of it, a thin, sweet note that quivered and then broke. They went up together. The storm refused to loosen its grip. The lighthouse stood as if in defiance, but inside the air was a graveyard of damp breath. John held the brass key in his palm like a debt long overdue. Simon turned the glass vial in his fingers, tilting it to the dim light. Inside, the shimmering substance caught every flicker of the stove and gave it back as if alive. Patrick didn't want to be near either. "You know what this is?" he said, though he didn't. His voice cracked. "That's grave goods. That's offerings from the drowned." Simon only shook his head, eyes still fixed on the vial. Not offerings. Tools. From the stairwell above came a sudden metallic creak, long and thin, as if a door rusted shut had been pried open by invisible hands. The three men froze. Then followed a sound like chains unspooling, rattling their iron complaint through the hollow spine of the tower. The key in John's hand felt heavier. He could see the staircase curve into shadow the way it swallowed the lamplight. "It fits something up there," he said. Patrick backed away. "And you think the thing that delivered it means us well? Maybe it means us to finish something." The speaking tube answered with a burst of static wheeze, then words shaped from waterlogged lungs. "Light us home." The sound traveled through them like fever. Patrick turned pale, muttering a prayer half-finished. Simon pushed himself to his feet. "Let's see what it wants." They climbed the spiral slick as a fish's backbone. Each step was a question. John held the key out like a talisman. Around them, the tower stones whispered with seepage drips, falling one by one into echoes deep as wells. At the lantern room door, they found the lock brass swollen with rust, but still alive. John slid the key in. It fit. He turned. The mechanism groaned once, then clicked with an obedience that felt too easy. The door swung inward. The lantern room was a ruin of salt and iron. The pedestal stood in the center, and upon it their lantern still burned faint but steady. But something had changed. The great ribs of the shattered Fresnel lens were no longer just debris. They had gathered as if rolled by unseen hands into a shape that curved toward the pedestal, eager to rebuild the eye. From outside, waves struck the rocks below, detonating with the violence of cannons. The entire tower shivered as though coughing water from its throat. On the floor, a hatch yawned open. None of them remembered it being there. From its black throat rose a draft colder than the sea. Patrick whispered, "I don't like this." John knelt beside the hatch. Rust had eaten the rim, but the dark beneath was clean, like an old wound never healed. He lowered the lantern. Stairs descended not stone, but iron, spiraling down into the very foundation of the rock. Simon exhaled. "A service tunnel." "No," John said. His voice broke on the word. "Older." From below, a single bell note floated up clear as silver struck in water. They descended. The steps rang underfoot hollow, as if suspended in nothing. The air thickened. It tasted of salt and iron, but also of oil, the tang of lanterns long extinguished. At the bottom lay a chamber. The walls were smooth, carved into the rock itself. And there, chained to the floor, was the remainder of the lens. Huge shards leaned together like cathedral glass, incomplete but yearning. The chains were not iron, but something darker, pitted with centuries. Patrick swore, voice high. "Why would they chain glass?" "Because glass remembers light," Simon said. The vial shook in his hand. Inside, the substance shimmered harder, like it wanted out. John understood, without knowing how. He took it, knelt, and pressed it into a socket in the glass. It fit with the finality of a key. The chamber answered with a low resonance, like a bow drawn across the world's oldest cello string. The air quivered. A chorus of drowned voices rose, muffled, broken, gasping as though the rock itself were lungs in seawater. Patrick staggered back. "We're not priests. We can't finish this." Simon's face was pale as chalk. "It doesn't want priests. It wants keepers." The lens stirred. A light began within it, not fire, not flame, but a drowned glow the color of moon through deep water. It spread across the glass, stitching the shards together. Chains fell loose, links dissolving into salt. Above, in the ruined lantern room, the tower groaned, and then the sound of gears returned, ratcheting, biting teeth, grinding, as if the old mechanism had been wound by a hand larger than the sea itself. John rose, lantern shaking in his grip. "If we don't keep it, it'll keep us." They fled the chamber. The spiral bled water now, each step slicker than before. They burst into the lantern room. The light was alive, pushing itself outward. The sea roared in response as if an army had shouted back. Patrick clutched his eyes. It's burning. The light, it burns. He fell to his knees. His scream tore out raw, echoing through the glass ribs, until it became not one voice, but many a choir of agony ringing like struck bells. John dragged him up. Simon seized the lantern and hurled it aside, but the lens did not falter. It had its own fuel now, its own will. From the sea came a new sound, a synchronized chant of men drowning, rising and falling with the waves, a cadence of suffering that rattled every stone. John leaned over the rail. Faces churned below pale and swollen eyes, blank mouths opening in perfect rhythm with the chant. Simon grabbed his shoulder. They've come for us. Then we pay, John whispered. Patrick's scream still rang in the stairwell, echoing like fire trapped in glass. John dragged him down into the keeper's house, but Patrick clawed at his face as if his eyes had become furnaces. His sockets wept blood and salt, the red, smeared with something white hot. Simon tried to hold him. Patrick stopped. Patrick convulsed, keening. Every sob sounded like glass shattering underwater, sharp and wet. They wrapped his head in damp cloth, but nothing cooled the burn. The light upstairs pulsed, beating like a second heart for the tower. Each pulse made the walls vibrate, timbers groaning as if the entire building were breathing through wood. John wiped his hands. It marked him. That light isn't ours to look at. Simon's jaw worked. Then why us? The speaking tube coughed, once wet, thick, and then moaned, "Keeper, keep." Patrick thrashed harder at the word, his scream changing pitch until it broke into a whimper. Simon held him, eyes grim. He won't last. John felt the truth as a weight. He thought of the legends, the last keeper walking into a storm the apprentice never found. He thought of the key, the vial, the way the sea delivers debts. Outside, the ocean roared each crash of surf like a beast slamming itself against the walls. The storm had deepened into a frenzy wind, shrieking like knives dragged across glass. "Listen," Simon said suddenly. Not the storm, beneath it. John held his breath. Between the crashes, he heard voices, hundreds, thousands, chanting in rhythm, a dirge of drowned syllables rising and falling with the waves. Patrick whimpered, clutching his ruined eyes. "They're calling me?" Simon looked at John. "Maybe that's the end. Maybe that's all they want." "No," John said, though his own voice trembled. "They want us all. They won't stop." The stove cracked, sparks spitting. From the chimney came a hollow howl as though something clawed at the flue, forcing its way down. The room filled with soot and salt spray. Patrick writhed. John grabbed the rope coil Patrick had found earlier and bound him through the younger sailor barely had strength left. "Help me get him to the boat," John said. Simon shook his head. "No boat leaves here." But John hauled Patrick to the door. The storm outside was not merely weather, it was a wall of sound. Rain hammered like nails against their faces, the ocean's roar so loud it swallowed their voices. The wind screamed high, and human threading its shrill note into every gap. He staggered to the cove. The skiff still waited, but it seemed smaller now, dwarfed by the sea that rose like a black cathedral around it. The faces churned in the water, pale blurs opening their mouths in unison. From the surf came a cry deep and thunderous, ours. Patrick twisted in John's grip. "I see them. They're waiting." His voice had softened into reverence, as if the pain were a summons. He pulled at the rope with sudden strength. Simon shouted, but too late. Patrick hurled himself from John's arms, stumbling down the rocks. He reached the edge and spread his arms wide. The sea answered with a deafening crash, swallowing him in one wave, bones cracking like snapped masts. His scream became a bubbling gurgle, lost to the chant of the drowned. Silence followed, but only for a breath. Then the chant grew louder, triumphant. The waves pounded the rollers by some savage rhythm. Boom, 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 each strike a drumbeat, demanding the next soul. Simon dragged John back. "We can't fight that." John shook his head, salt stinging his eyes. "But we can't leave it either. If it keeps calling, others will come. They'll follow the light. And it'll take them too." Above, the lens hummed with a steady drone, low and resonant, as if the tower itself had become a throat. Simon clenched his fists. "Then we end it." John looked at him. With what Simon's gaze went to the coat they had found heavy wool draped across a chair. Inside still sat the lead tag with the Lighthouse insignia. He picked it up, held it tight. The keeper's oath doesn't end when the keeper dies. That's what this is. John hesitated. "So we take the place," No Simon said. His eyes were hollow now. "We pay the debt." The speaking tube whined a piercing feedback that stabbed the ears before hissing a single word down. They understood. The chamber below. The chained glass that was no longer chained. The lens that had been rebuilt by their hands. "Then we go back," John said, though dread thickened every word. They descended again, the iron stairs slick with condensation. Patrick's absence felt like a hole walking with them. The chamber below vibrated with a constant bass note, vibrating the rock itself. Every surface dripped. Every drop landed with a plink that echoed like a clock counting down. The lens pulsed brighter now, a drowned glow filling the cavern. Shadows of faces twisted inside it, mouths moving as if still shouting through water. The vial had dissolved the substance inside, consumed. The chains were gone entirely. Simon stepped forward, holding the lead tag high. If it wants a keeper, it has one. John grabbed his arm. "You won't come back." Simon didn't flinch. "Neither will you?" "Not really." The lens gave a groan like ice breaking on a frozen lake, and the drowned chorus swelled until the chamber quaked. John realized then the lighthouse was never meant to save sailors. It was meant to guide them to their end, to mark the place where the living must join the drowned. Every keeper had only been a temporary custodian of a bargain far older than stone. And now it was their turn. The chamber below trembled as if the sea itself were inside the stone. John and Simon stood at the edge of the lens, watching its drowned light pulse like a heartbeat. The glow threw their faces into gaunt masks, pale and hollow. Simon stepped closer. "It's not just a light. It's a mouth." John shuddered. "And a grave." The lens groaned low and grinding like glaciers colliding beneath black water. From its facets, shapes swam men in uniforms, faces, bloated eyes rolled white. Their muffled shouts echoed inside the cavern, distorted wet like orders screamed through salt. Simon held up the lead tag. They chained it once. They tried to bind it. But chains don't hold hunger. John looked at him, realizing what Simon meant. "No." "Yes," Simon said. His voice was steady, but his hands trembled. "The keeper pays." The speaking tube above them hissed, crackled, and shrieked one word down into the cavern. Keeper Simon dropped the tag. It rang like iron on iron. He stepped onto the rim of the lens. The drowned glow licked his boots. John grabbed him. "Don't." Simon's face was pale yet calm. "John, listen. It won't stop. Not until it takes someone in. That's the bargain." John shook his head, tears stinging his eyes. Then let it take me. But Simon shoved him back with surprising strength. You've carried too many ghosts. Let me. The cavern filled with a chorus of voices, howling, gasping, pleading, all rising in a single wail. It shook the walls like thunder trapped underground. Simon raised his arms. The light surged upward, blinding. The drowned voices crescendoed, screaming in joy, in agony, an orchestra of the lost. Then with a final cry, Simon let himself fall into the center of the lens. The glow swallowed him whole. For an instant, John saw Simon's silhouette burning like a man made of glass. Then he was gone. The chamber shrieked a screech across the crystal, and a deep moan like the earth splitting. John fell to his knees. His ears bled. His eyes swam with after-images of Simon dissolving into light. When the noise faded, the lens stood whole again. It had rebuilt itself, fused and alive. And inside its glow, faint and terrible, Simon's face stared back. His eyes were blank, his mouth moving in silent chant with the drowned. Above the lighthouse gears thundered the ratcheting echo so loud it shook the entire tower. The great beacon roared to life, its beam cutting across the storm like a blade. John staggered up the iron stairs. The whole tower vibrated, a colossal throat chanting with the sea. He reached the lantern room. The beam swept across the Atlantic, white and merciless. Outside, the ocean erupted with cries, hundreds of them, distant, near overlapping the chorus of men drowning again and again. John gripped the railing, staring into the storm. He understood now Simon had not ended the hunger. He had only fed it. Behind him, the speaking tube whispered Simon's voice, now fused with the others. Keep the light. John closed his eyes. Then it's my turn. The storm did not relent. If anything, it grew hungrier. The beam swept across the black Atlantic, relentless calling. John clung to the railing in the lantern room, his face lit by the merciless glow. The sea below howled back. The cries of the drowned rolled in waves, each voice torn and ragged, but unified in chorus. Simon's face hovered in the lens, now pale and chanting with the multitude. His mouth-shaped words John could not bear to hear. Every revolution of the light showed him again imprisoned a saint of salt and grief. John stumbled down to the keeper's house. The stove had gone cold. The tea tins lay scattered. Patrick's bottle glinted half submerged in rainwater blown through the cracks. He picked it up, but the smell of spirits turned his stomach. He wanted no comfort now, only silence. And silence had no place in this tower. The speaking tube burbled wetly, then whispered in three voices at once, Simon, Patrick, and something older keeper. John shouted back raw, then take me. The lighthouse groaned once with stone cracking gears, grinding the sound of an old throat clearing itself for song. He climbed once more slower, now his body aching, his mind clear with the inevitability of sacrifice. Each step dripped water. Each drop echoed like a death knell in the stairway. In the lantern room, the lens pulsed, demanding. John stood before it. He remembered every shipwreck he had ever seen, every body carried ashore like driftwood, every widow screaming on the rocks. Perhaps he had carried this debt his whole life. The light burned his skin, but he did not flinch. I will keep it, he said. His voice was small, but the tower heard. He stepped onto the rim. The glow reached for him eagerly. The chamber erupted in screams, not of pain alone, but of triumph, the chorus swelling until it rattled glass, bone, and air alike. John spread his arms. Let this end. The light consumed him. It poured into his mouth, his eyes his lung. He felt his bones crack, marrow boiling. He screamed once, a scream that split into 1,000 echoes, bouncing through the storm like cannon fire. Then silence. When the glow dimmed, the lantern room stood empty. Only the lens remained whole and shining. In its facets, 3 faces swam. Patrick, Simon, John, each chanting, mouths opening and closing in rhythm with the drowned. Outside the ocean's roar, deepened the chant, swelling to a thunderous hymn. The beam cut steady across the waves, and ships far away might have seen it, wondering who kept the light. But no one stood at the controls. No hand turned the gears. No living soul remained in the tower. The lighthouse kept itself now, and from its crown, through storm and night, came the endless sound of detonated voices crying, and the iron heart of the tower ticking, keeping us eternal.